The dining room of Ashford Park held 30 people in perfect, appalled silence. Jasmine stood at the far end of the table, her hands loose at her sides, her plain gray gown a quiet reproach among the jeweled satins and embroidered silks of Lady Dorothea's assembled guests. The candlelight from the two great chandeliers fell without favor on everyone in the room. And what it showed, if one looked, was a young woman of 25 who had not moved an inch since the Dowager Duchess had spoken. "She is unworthy of this house," Lady Dorothea had said, her fan folded at a measured height, her diamonds catching the light with a kind of offended precision. "Unworthy of this name, unworthy of this table." The words had settled over the room like frost over a garden in the small hours of the morning, killing what they touched. Edmund Vane, the Duke of Ashford, sat at the head of the table, and for a moment no one could have read his face at all. His jaw was still. His hands rested flat on the white linen. Then he pushed back his chair. What happened next was the kind of thing that altered the record of a room permanently, so that no one who witnessed it ever quite remembered the dinner that had preceded it. Only the crossing. He had not yet reached her when Jasmine raised her chin. She did not yet know that reaching her was exactly where he was going. The story of how Jasmine Larson had come to stand in that dining room, in that gray gown, before those 30 witnesses, began in a far less dramatic register, as most stories of genuine consequence tend to do. It began with a letter, a small trunk, and a carriage journey of 4 hours from a set of lodgings in Kensington that she had been vacating, quietly and without ceremony, for 3 weeks. Her father, Arvid Larson, had been a scholar and translator of some reputation in Stockholm and of modest reputation in London, where he had come with Jasmine's English mother 30 years before and never entirely left. He had translated documents from Swedish, Danish, German, French, Italian, and Latin for a circle of publishers and diplomats and one unusually literate earl, and he had taught his daughter each language with the same methodical affection he applied to everything. Jasmine's mother had died when Jasmine was 11, and her father had compensated by educating her with a rigor that produced, by the time she was 20, a young woman who could read Dante in the original and write a business letter in 4 languages and had opinions about the subjunctive in ecclesiastical Latin that her father called correct, and her few acquaintances in London society called peculiar. When her father died in February, he left her £40 per annum in personal savings and a box of dictionaries, and the savings would not last the spring. She found the advertisement for a companion governess through a friend of her mother's cousin, a Mrs. Pennington, who had heard from a Lady Forster that the household of the Duke of Ashford required a governess for a young girl of 7 years, the Duke's daughter by his late wife. The wage was £40 annually. Jasmine accepted by return of post. She did not advertise her languages. The advertisement had asked for French and basic music instruction and a suitable disposition, and she possessed all 3 without the conversation that would follow if she mentioned the others. She had learned, some time before her father died, that the mention of 6 languages in a social context produced one of 2 responses from the people one needed to persuade, either a flattering disbelief that she considered exhausting or a sudden wariness, as though competence in a young woman of no particular fortune was a kind of low cunning. She had learned to mention French, only French. Lady Dorothea Vane was not, technically, the mistress of Ashford Park. She had been the mother of the late Duchess Elise, and she had remained in residence since Elise's death 2 years prior, ostensibly to assist with the care of her granddaughter Nora, and in practice to function as the social authority of a household whose master was not interested in social authority. Lady Dorothea was a small, upright woman of 62 who wore her gray hair in careful waves under a succession of excellent caps, and whose fan was always at a measured height, and who understood the grammar of Regency drawing rooms with the precision of a native speaker. When Jasmine arrived at Ashford Park on a cool morning in April, Lady Dorothea received her in the yellow drawing room with the particular courtesy one extends to persons whose presence one finds necessary, but not welcome. "Miss Larson," she said, "the French governess." "I am not strictly a French governess, my lady," Jasmine said. "I am a general governess. French is among my subjects." Lady Dorothea's fan shifted a single degree. "Yes," she said, "I have no doubt." That was the extent of the welcome. Jasmine was shown to her room on the 3rd floor by a footman named Henry, who was 17 and red-eared and carried her trunk up the stairs with the concentrated effort of someone who would not be bested by luggage in front of company. Her room was small and clean, with a window overlooking the kitchen garden, and she stood at it for a moment after Henry had departed and looked at the beds of parsley and sage laid out with a soldier's neatness, and thought that the kitchen garden, at least, was orderly and honest, and that she could learn to prefer a view of honest things. She met Lady Dorothea's companion, a nervous woman named Mrs. Cartwright, at supper that evening, and one of the lady's London acquaintances, a Miss Cecily Hartwell, who was staying at the park for the month, and whose muslin gown alone cost more than Jasmine's annual wage. Cecily was beautiful in the way that very confident people sometimes are, her blonde hair arranged to best advantage, her manners toward Jasmine precisely calibrated, not quite the courtesy extended to an equal, and just a shade warmer than the notice given to a servant. It was, Jasmine thought privately, an impressive performance. The Duke of Ashford she did not meet that first evening. He was, Henry told her, in his study. He was, Henry implied without quite saying so, frequently in his study. She met Nora the following morning. The child was sitting in the schoolroom on the 2nd floor, her small hands folded in her lap, a French primer open on the table before her at page 1. She was 7 years old and slight, with her father's coloring, dark hair and gray eyes, and a quality of stillness about her that was not the stillness of a calm child, but of a child who had learned to take up as little space as possible. She looked at Jasmine when she entered and did not speak. "Good morning," Jasmine said in English. Nora said nothing. "Bonjour," Jasmine tried, settling into the chair across from her. Nora's eyes moved a fraction. "Je m'appelle Jasmine," she continued. "Comment tu t'appelles?" A long pause. Then, very quietly, from a child who apparently had decided that French was somehow less frightening than English. "Nora." "Nora," Jasmine repeated, as if it were a satisfactory answer to a question. "C'est un joli nom." She did not push further that morning. She read aloud from the primer, slowly and with expression, and watched Nora's hands gradually unfold in her lap. And when she left at noon, she felt that she had accomplished something real, though she could not have specified precisely what. It was during the 3rd week that she began to sing. She had been teaching Nora a French children's song, a simple melody about a bird in a garden, and the child had been watching her mouth with the intense concentration of someone learning a difficult geography. Jasmine sang it twice, then sat quietly, and after a moment Nora began to hum along, barely audible, the thread of the melody fragile and determined. Jasmine did not remark on it. She continued to play the notes on the schoolroom's small upright piano, and let the humming happen around her like weather. She did not hear the door open. She would not have been able to say, afterward, how long he had been standing in the doorway before she became aware of a quality of attention in the room that had not been there before. When she turned, he was already still, one hand on the doorframe, his face unreadable. He was tall, dark-haired, and his coat was not the coat of a man who had dressed for company. He looked as though he had been walking in the park and had come upstairs for a reason he had not yet named, even to himself. He looked at Nora. She was still humming. Something shifted in his expression that Jasmine could not parse. It was brief and involuntary, and he controlled it before she could read it completely. He withdrew from the doorway without speaking, and the sound of his footsteps receded down the corridor, and Nora continued to hum, and Jasmine turned back to the piano keys and did not press a single note for a full 30 seconds. She did not yet understand what she had witnessed in his face. She had catalogued it only as grief, recognizable, some emotion underneath the grief, not yet named. If you have ever quietly hoped that a person would simply see you, without requiring you to perform or justify or translate yourself into a language their world considers respectable, you will understand something of what the next weeks at Ashford Park cost Jasmine. She paid attention here, if you have found her worth your time so far, because the story is just beginning to gather itself. Lady Dorothea's first public voicing came at the Ashford Park Ball, which was held on the 18th of April to mark, as far as Jasmine could understand, the existence of the spring season and the availability of the ballroom, which was very fine, and had not been properly used since Elise's death. Jasmine was not a guest at the ball. She was present in the capacity of ensuring that Nora, permitted to watch the dancing from the upper gallery for 1 hour before bed, did not fall through the balustrade. She stood beside Nora in the gallery in her plain gray gown, and watched the room below arrange itself into its patterns of silk and jewel, and manage desire, and thought of her father's translations, how the same sentence in German and in Italian was the same thought wearing different costumes, and how the thought underneath never changed no matter how the costume shifted. Below her, she could see Cecily Hartwell moving through the room with the grace of someone who had been practicing this specific performance since childhood, her ivory gown luminous under the chandeliers. The Duke of Ashford stood near the windows at the far end of the room, alone in the way that men of great social authority are sometimes alone even inside a crowd, because the crowd adjusts itself around them rather than including them. He was watching the dancing. His expression was the same measured blankness she had seen in the schoolroom doorway, controlled and present, and concealing something she could not name. Then Lady Dorothea appeared at Jasmine's elbow, which was startling enough that Jasmine took half a step back. She had not heard her come up. "You are staring," Lady Dorothea said, very low, addressing not Nora but Jasmine. "My son-in-law does not require the attention of a governess." "I was watching the dancing, my lady," Jasmine said. "Were you?" Lady Dorothea said. Not a question. Her fan was at its measured height, and her eyes were very clear and cold. "You should understand your position here, Miss Larson. The foreign creature, however accomplished in her small way, does not belong in this company's eye. She belongs with the child." She descended the stairs before Jasmine could form an answer. She would have been wise not to speak. Nora had not appeared to hear. She was watching the dancing below with her chin on the balustrade rail, her small profile intent. Jasmine put one hand briefly on the child's shoulder and said nothing. Below, near the windows, the Duke of Ashford had turned his head. He was looking up at the gallery. Jasmine could not be certain, at that distance, what he saw. She stepped back from the railing. The morning after the ball, she found a small note on the table in the schoolroom. It was written in a hand that was spare and clear, and would not have been mistaken for Lady Dorothea's elaborate pen. It said only, "Nora is eating more." The connection to what happens in this room is noted. It was not signed. She set it in the drawer of the schoolroom table and went on with the lesson. She began to understand something of his wound in the weeks that followed, not from anything he said to her directly, for he spoke to her infrequently and in the short declarative register of a man who has learned that brevity prevents misunderstanding, but from what she observed and from what she learned from Henry, who was 17 and not yet capable of withholding information from someone who was kind to him. His wife Elise had died 2 years ago, in January, in childbirth. The child had not survived either. Elise had been at Ashford Park for the autumn, and the Duke had wanted her in London for the winter, for the physicians, for the society his late wife had loved. He had insisted, Henry said, carefully not meeting Jasmine's eyes, on the London house. And she had died there in January, in a cold room with snow against the windows, and he had been in the next room and had not been able to undo it. He carried a miniature of her. Jasmine had seen it once, briefly, when he reached for something in his coat pocket in the corridor, and the small oval case caught the light before he closed his hand around it. She had looked away immediately, and had not looked back. She understood then what she had seen in his face in the schoolroom doorway when Nora began to hum. He had not expected Nora to make sound. He had been carrying the particular grief of a man who believed that his decisions had not only taken his wife, but had hollowed out his daughter. And then from a doorway he had heard Nora hum. The knowledge of it sat in Jasmine's chest as a specific weight. Not pity, exactly. Something more like recognition. The way one recognizes a word in a language one has never formally studied because the root is familiar. She thought, he has been punishing himself with her silence as proof. She did not think. And now she is no longer silent. She let the thought be what it was. Without drawing a conclusion she had no right to draw. It was William Forster who came to her on a Tuesday in May, when the lilacs in the walled garden were at their height, and the air through the schoolroom window carried a sweetness that felt almost ironic given the nature of his errand. He was a precise man of 50. Forster, with the kind of face that gave nothing away in situations where giving nothing away was professionally necessary. He asked if she had a moment. She sent Nora to practice her scales. He offered her £100. He did not frame it as a dismissal, exactly. He framed it as a generous resolution of an arrangement that Lady Dorothea had determined was not quite suitable, given certain considerations of the household's social standing, the upcoming events of the summer season, and the general view that a governess of Miss Larson's particular background, however personally accomplished, might not best serve the household's interests. Jasmine looked at him for a moment. Lady Dorothea does not employ me, she said. No, Forster said carefully. She does not. The Duke employs me. He does, Forster said. Has the Duke expressed a wish for my departure? A pause that lasted perhaps 2 seconds longer than it should have. The matter has not been raised with His Grace directly. Then I will remain, Jasmine said, until His Grace tells me himself that I am no longer needed. She heard from the next room the sound of Nora working through a scale on the piano, careful and a little uneven, and completely real. Forster folded his papers and departed. She did not tell Edmund about the visit. She did not know then that he found out from Forster anyway, that same evening. Because Forster had the professional scrupulousness to record all household matters, and the additional quality of not enjoying being made an instrument of a thing he considered procedurally irregular. He told the Duke. The Duke said nothing that Forster later reported, but Forster noted that he had sat very still for a moment, and then thanked him, and closed the study door. The dinner was held on the last Friday of May. Lady Dorothea had arranged it with the efficiency she brought to all social machinery. 30 guests carefully selected. The table laid with the Ashford Park china and the silver that had been in the family since the Regency's early years, candles in the great silver branches, flowers from the walled garden. Cecily Hartwell was present, seated 3 chairs to Edmund's left. Jasmine was not a dinner guest. She was present at the table's far end because Lady Dorothea had specifically requested, with perfect courtesy, that she be on hand to help Nora, who had been given special permission to attend the first 30 minutes of the gathering before retiring. Nora sat beside her, very upright, her small hands in her lap. Jasmine watched the table fill and settle and begin to perform itself. She watched Cecily lean toward Edmund with a remark that produced no visible response in him, and then look away with the practiced composure of someone who had been trained never to show a rebuff. She watched Lady Dorothea preside from her end of the table with the ease of a woman who had been managing rooms like this one for 40 years. It was during the second remove that it happened. The conversation had turned, as conversations at tables like this one sometimes did, to the question of accomplishments. A Mr. Dalby, red-faced and genial, had been praising his niece's Italian, and Mrs. Dalby had mentioned that French was, of course, indispensable, and Cecily had said something graceful about the value of musical education, and Lady Dorothea had let the conversation ripen for exactly the correct number of seconds before she turned her gaze down the table. "Miss Larson assists with Nora's French," she said, with the pleasantness of someone offering a compliment and withdrawing it in the same breath. A useful skill for a governess, no doubt, though of course breeding and genuine education are quite another matter. The table shifted its attention. Jasmine felt it the way one feels a drop in temperature, specific and physical, the small hairs along her forearms rising under her sleeves. "One must not," Lady Dorothea continued, looking now at the guest to her left as though making a general observation of no particular target. "Mistake facility with languages for genuine formation. A foreign creature may acquire a surface. It is not the same thing as substance." The table was very quiet. Nora's hand, beside Jasmine's, had closed into a small, tight fist on the tablecloth. Jasmine placed her fingers over the child's knuckles, very lightly, and did not move. At the head of the table, Edmund had gone very still. "In any case," Lady Dorothea said, the point apparently made to her satisfaction, "she is, I am afraid, simply unworthy of this house. This table, this name." She lifted her wineglass. The silence that followed had texture. Jasmine was aware of 30 faces, some studiously arranged toward their plates, some less artfully averted. She was aware of Nora's small hand under hers, the knuckles sharp and trembling. She was aware of her own breathing, steady because she had made it steady, the same way she had made herself walk at a measured pace through every corridor of this house for 7 weeks. She had no rank to answer with. She had no title, no fortune, no connection that the room would recognize as grounds for a defense. She had only the £40 a year she had been paid, and a dead father's dictionaries, and 7 weeks of quiet work in a schoolroom upstairs. She was aware, distantly, that this was exactly what Lady Dorothea had understood and planned for. Then the chair at the head of the table moved. Edmund did not hurry. His movement across the dining room had the quality of something inevitable, the way a tide comes in, without announcement and without the possibility of argument. The room watched him come. Cecily's expression shifted, just once, before she arranged it back into composure. Lady Dorothea's hand tightened on her wineglass, a single involuntary fraction. He stopped at the far end of the table. He looked at Jasmine, and his face was still, and his eyes were the color of deep water on a gray day. And he said, in a voice that carried without any effort to every corner of the room, "I have been told you are accomplished in languages, Miss Larson. Enlighten us." It was not an invitation. It was not a rescue, at least not in any form she had been taught to recognize as one. It was a door opened by someone who had calculated that she could walk through it, if she would. She looked at him for the space of a breath. Then she said, clearly, without heat, in the same measured voice she used in the schoolroom, "English, French, Italian, German, Swedish, and Latin, Your Grace. Though Latin tends to surprise people, and I generally keep it in reserve." The room did not move. A guest near the center of the table, a Lady Pembroke who was 60, and had known Edmund since his childhood, made a sound that was not quite a laugh, and not quite a gasp, and was perhaps the honest expression of a mind revising itself. Edmund held her gaze for a moment longer. Something in his face, the controlled blankness she had catalogued for 7 weeks, cracked along a line that had apparently always been there. And what was underneath it was not the warmth of a man performing feeling for an audience, but the specific private recognition of a person who has been watching carefully and has finally arrived at a fact he had already suspected. 6 languages, he said. 6, she confirmed. He turned then to his mother-in-law. Lady Dorothea had set down her wine glass at some point in the last 30 seconds. Her fan was in her lap. Closed. It was the first time in 7 weeks that Jasmine had seen the fan closed, and the detail registered in the room. She could feel it registering, the way a wrong note in a familiar piece registers in the ear of someone who knows the melody. Edmund did not raise his voice. He did not require volume for what he said next, because the room was already perfectly silent. "Miss Larson," he said, "is in this house because I placed her in this house. She is in this dining room because Nora is in this dining room, and Nora is in this dining room because she has eaten 3 meals a day for 5 weeks running, and she is playing the piano again." He paused. "These are facts of my household, and they are not open to revision." Lady Dorothea's expression did not collapse in the theatrical sense. She was not a woman given to theatrical collapse. What happened instead was a slow, precise recession of confidence, the way ice retreats under a changing temperature, not dramatically, but with a completeness that could not be mistaken for anything else. She understood, evidently, that she had miscalculated the variable she had least accounted for. She had not accounted for what his daughter's recovery was worth to him. Forster, who had been present at the table as the household solicitor and an occasional guest, cleared his throat from his position near the window. "Your Grace," he said, "the household arrangements are, as you note, entirely within your authority. I can confirm, should confirmation be of use to anyone present, that no changes to Miss Larson's employment have been sanctioned by this house's master." It was stated with the absolute neutrality of a man who had been waiting several weeks to say it. The room absorbed this. Cecily Hartwell looked at her wine glass and made no sound. Edmund looked at Jasmine again, and this time there was no blankness in it. What there was instead was the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for 2 years and has recently allowed himself to wonder whether he is required to carry it alone forever. "Miss Larson," he said, "will you stay?" It was not a question in the technical sense. It was a short, declarative sentence spoken to her across 30 witnesses, in the same dining room where the dismissal had been attempted, carrying more weight in its 4 syllables than she had been prepared to receive. She met his eyes. "Yes, Your Grace," she said. "I will." The candles did not flicker. The room did not applaud. No one moved dramatically. What happened instead was the subtle, social reordering of 30 people who had witnessed a social hierarchy's verdict reversed by its highest representative in the specific arena where the verdict had been delivered, and who were now quietly recalibrating the record. Lady Dorothea rose from her chair at a correct and unhurried pace, made her excuses to the guests nearest her with the polished facility of decades, and left the dining room. Mrs. Cartwright followed, as she always followed, a pale shape at the edge of the room. The conversation resumed at the table, slowly at first, and then with the warmth of people who feel the particular relief of attention resolved, and Mr. Dalby called for more wine, and Lady Pembroke began to speak to the gentleman on her left about the Italian opera in terms that suggested she had revised her evening upward in unexpected ways. Nora had not moved through any of it. She sat very straight beside Jasmine, her small hand still inside Jasmine's, and she was watching her father with an expression that was not yet the full language of children's love restored, but was something adjacent to it, something in the early grammar of it. Jasmine looked down at her. "Tout va bien," she said quietly. Nora considered this. Then she nodded, once, with the gravity of a 7-year-old delivering a formal verdict. The following days at Ashford Park were quieter than any that had preceded them. Not with the hollow quiet of a house where a thing has been suppressed, but with the specific quiet of a house where something has been set down, and the absence of its weight changes the acoustics. Lady Dorothea spent 2 days in her rooms. On the 3rd day, she came to Jasmine in the schoolroom at an hour when Nora was at her piano practice, and said in a voice stripped of its measured hauteur that she had perhaps judged by the wrong instrument. She did not say more than that. She did not need to. Jasmine received it with the grace the situation required, and did not ask for more than was offered, because more was not the thing she had ever wanted from that quarter. What she had wanted, though she had not permitted herself to name it for some weeks, was something else entirely, and it declared itself by degrees, in the way that things which are real tend to declare themselves, not in dramatic single moments, but in the accumulation of small particular acts. He came to the schoolroom more often than he needed to, for reasons that did not always survive examination. He asked questions about Nora's progress with a specificity that suggested he had been listening through doorways for longer than he had previously admitted. He appeared in the corridor when she was returning from the walled garden and fell into step beside her for the length of the east wing, saying nothing in particular, but saying it in a way that was different in kind from silence. He brought her, one morning, a German grammar that had been in the library since his own father's time, because he had apparently remembered that she had mentioned, in passing, that her father's copy had been sold with the rest of his library. She held the book for a moment, without speaking. "It is not a gift," he said. "The library has 20 languages it cannot read. It is more useful in your hands." "Yes, Your Grace," she said. "Edmund," he said. She looked up. His face was the careful, controlled face she had been cataloging for weeks. But there was something in the set of his jaw that was different now. Something that required an effort she could read because she had learned to read him, the way one learns a language by listening very hard to the distance between what is said and what is meant. "Edmund," she said. The word sat between them in the corridor, with a weight entirely disproportionate to its 2 syllables. He reached into his coat pocket then, not for a document or a letter, but for the small oval miniature case she had seen once before. He held it for a moment, not opening it. "Her name was Elise," he said. She would have liked very much to speak 6 languages. She spoke French and a little Italian, and she believed firmly that Latin was an act of cruelty imposed on the young. A pause. She was not wrong. "She sounds as though she was decided in her opinions," Jasmine said. "She was," he said. "She was also very right, more often than not." He was quiet for a moment. "I kept her in London that winter. I believed the physicians there were better equipped. She died in January in a house I chose, and I have spent 2 years being certain that certainty killed her." Jasmine did not offer the absolution that people reflexively offer the grieving, because she did not think he would believe it from a source that had not known Elise, and because she did not think he was asking for absolution. She thought he was simply saying the thing aloud. For possibly the first time, to someone he had determined could hold it without flinching or without rushing to remove its weight from him. "Nora has her eyes," he said. "I know," Jasmine said. "She has her father's stubbornness." Something altered in his expression, not the collapse she had witnessed at the dinner table, but something quieter, the faint involuntary revision of a face that had been held at a specific tension for 2 years and had just been told, by a person who meant it, that his daughter was stubborn in the way that living people are stubborn. He put the miniature back in his pocket. He looked at her. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for the dinner." "You have nothing to apologize for," she said. "You were not the person who spoke." "I was the person who should have spoken sooner." She held the German grammar and looked at him, and thought that this was what it felt like to be seen, not as a problem to be managed, or a foreign creature to be tolerated, or a governess of useful languages, but as a specific person whose specific qualities had been observed over time by someone who had been paying attention when she did not know it. She thought of her father's dictionaries, sold. She thought of the kitchen garden she had learned to prefer for its honesty. She thought of Nora humming in the schoolroom in the early weeks, the sound so tentative it might have been mistaken for the wind. "You spoke when it mattered," she said. "That is the correct time." He was quiet for a moment. The corridor light was the gray and gold of a May afternoon, the kind that suggests summer is not yet arrived, but is sending word ahead. "I should like," he said, and then paused in the way of a man who has been precise and controlled for long enough that beginning a sentence without knowing its end is a significant act. "I should like for this to be your home, Miss Larson. Jasmine, if you are willing to stay, not because I ask it in a dining room in front of 30 witnesses, but because you choose it." She was quiet for a moment herself. "You should know," she said, "that I do not speak all 6 languages equally well. My Latin tends toward the ecclesiastical. It is less useful at dinner parties." The corner of his mouth moved. It was a brief and involuntary thing, almost immediately contained, but she saw it, and she suspected that in the weeks and months ahead she would learn to read all the small, involuntary things in his face with the same fluency with which she had learned to read all her other languages, by attention and patience, and the willingness to stay in the room when the grammar became difficult. "I am not," he said, "in the habit of hosting dinner parties." "Then we are suited," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer, with the expression of a man who has arrived at a place he did not expect to find himself, and has discovered, to his cautious relief, that it is a place he recognizes. Forster came to the study that same afternoon, and Edmund confirmed what he already knew was true, that the household arrangements were settled, that Miss Larson's position was permanent, and its terms improved to reflect the reality of what she was to the household, and that Lady Dorothea was welcome to remain at Ashford Park as a guest of the estate, on the condition that she understood the estate's master had made his view clear and would not revisit it. Forster noted this with the thoroughness he brought to all things, and departed without editorial comment, though Jasmine, if she had seen his face in the corridor a moment later, might have recognized the expression of a man whose professional life had just become somewhat more straightforward. Lady Dorothea departed for Bath at the end of the month. She wrote, before she left, a letter to her granddaughter that was formal and a little stiff, and that contained, in its final paragraph, something that was not quite an apology for the dinner, but was as close as a woman of her formation could approach, without the vocabulary for the thing itself. Nora read the letter carefully in the schoolroom, while Jasmine sat across from her and waited. Then she folded it, set it on the table, and asked if they might do the French song again. They did. Miss Cecily Hartwell departed for London the week following the dinner, with the composure of a young woman whose script had been written for a different production, and who was intelligent enough to understand this, without requiring it to be said. She left a small, correctly worded note for the house, wished Nora well in a postscript that was entirely genuine, and was gone before the lilacs had finished flowering. Winter came to Ashford Park in November, as it always had, preceded by the smell of cold stone and dead leaves, and followed by the first frost on the walled garden. Jasmine had been in the house 7 months when the snow arrived, and she stood at the window of what had been her small third-floor room and looked out at the kitchen garden rendered white and abstract under 3 inches of new snow, and felt the curious sensation of a person who has arrived at a place they did not expect, and has found it claims them in spite of the expectation. She was no longer in the third-floor room. She had moved, at Edmund's quiet insistence, and with Forster's confirmation of the propriety of the arrangement, to a set of rooms on the 2nd floor, adjoining the schoolroom, with a window that overlooked the front park and the long alley of elms that led to the gate. That evening, after supper, she came to the drawing room to find the fire burning in the great hearth, and Nora sitting at the drawing room's piano, a better instrument by considerable measure than the schoolroom's upright, her small hands placed with the careful attention of a child who has been taught that the beginning of a piece deserves respect. She began to play. The melody was the French song about the bird in the garden, the one Jasmine had sung in the schoolroom in the early weeks, when Nora's voice had been barely audible, the thread of it tentative as something just beginning to grow. Nora played it now with both hands, the melody in the right and a simple harmony in the left, and she played it from memory, without the sheet. Edmund was standing near the fireplace. He had not sat down. He was looking at his daughter, and on his face was the expression that Jasmine had seen in the schoolroom doorway in April, the grief and the unnamed thing underneath it. But the proportions had shifted over 7 months, and what she saw now was grief present, and acknowledged and accompanied, no longer alone in the room with him. He reached into his coat pocket. He took out the small oval miniature case, and he crossed to the mantelpiece, and he set it down, face up, in the warm light of the fire. He did not speak. He did not need to. Nora finished the song and lifted her hands from the keys with the care she had been taught, and turned on the bench to look at her father. And something in her small face was the early grammar of a child returning to herself, one phrase at a time. Jasmine stood in the doorway of the drawing room and looked at the fire and the child and the miniature face up in the light, and the snow falling outside the tall windows against the dark of the park. And she felt the specific, grounded warmth of a person who has finally arrived at a place where her worth does not require translation. Edmund turned from the mantelpiece and looked at her across the room. She was home. If Jasmine's story moved something in you today, leave a word in the comments about the moment that stayed with you. There are more stories where this one came from, and this channel exists because you keep coming back to them.